Hi, welcome back. Something I want to cover today is this classic thing about repetitive processing. And the thing I want to cover specifically is something that I see all the time, which is minus 100 highlights plus 100 shadows. Whenever I do processing sessions on workshops, I see it often in that clients sit there and they do their processing and they've done this minus 100 highlights plus 100 shadows. And I say, why did you do that? And I've never heard a good answer other than it's what I always do, or it's what I learnt to do, or it's something I saw in a YouTube video how to do. And what I want to do today is look at it and really understand what is there any advantage of doing it that way, and what are the disadvantages of doing it that way. So it's going to be a really simple video today. We're going to look at numerous examples, and we're going to understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And if at the end of this session, the next time you feel obligated or the desire to do that, all I want to achieve today is that you ask the question, why am I doing that, and is it the right thing to do? If you get to that point, you've suddenly had this paradigm shift where you're no longer in repetitive processing and you're in creativity. And that's what we're going to cover today. So let's get on with it. So here we are back again in Adobe Lightroom. Let's start with a very simple scenario here. If you were going to write a story about an experience that you'd had, you would want free rein to say what you wanted. You wouldn't want anybody else's input. You certainly wouldn't want anybody else saying, well, you have to say this and you have to say that, and you've got to say this bit first and then you've got to say something else. You want free control. Now, working images is exactly the same. There's no point in starting off with something that is going to dictate pretty much the rest of the process. So in this shot here, which is taken in the Scottish Highlands, we can see that it's a very pretty scene. I mean, it was a beautiful calm morning, looking over the loch here, and I kind of like the kind of just the general atmosphere of this image. I'm just going to start here with a couple of little basic corrections like lens corrections and stuff. Now, let's start our process with that dreaded minus 100 highlights and plus 100 shadows. Now, if you start your process like that, you're now dictating where you're going to go with this. You're basically saying, I want to see all the detail in my shadows and I want to see all the detail in my highlights. Now, if you then try to process this image from this point, you've already been forced down a road that you may not necessarily want to walk down. So even if I just look at backing up slightly, so if I just take back the shadows, so I've opened them a bit, so now that's 75% or plus 75 in shadows, but it's not 100. So that choice, if I zero my shadows and take it back to nothing, you may like that very dark, moody, suppressed. Because if you show detail in shadows, you're basically taking all the mystery out of that scenario. The more you show in your shadows, so as I move the slider to the right and start opening up detail there, things become more explicit, less mysterious, and you might get to a point where you say, okay, I kind of like that. And funnily enough, I'm back at plus 73. So for me, there may be a sweet spot in showing some detail, but not all the detail. Now, the same goes for the highlight slider, in that as soon as you start killing your highlights, you're actually taking luminosity out of your file. So you're making it less luminous by showing more contrast, or sorry, showing more detail in your shadows there, or sorry, your highlights there. So at the end of the day, that becomes a creative choice. Now I can come in here with a bunch of other sliders and really start changing the feel of that image. But at the end of the day, I'm not looking at numbers and I'm not looking at preconceived ideas. All I'm doing is looking at this image and thinking, right, well, how do I want it to look? And every time I move a slider, I'm doing it by feel rather than any kind of preconceived processing by numbers. Now, I appreciate that this involves understanding what the tools do, but I'd rather be in a position where I'm creating by feel and intuition rather than start with 100 minus, start with 100 plus, and then somehow try to piece together what I can do with that file. So this is the first example, which is really my excuse to say, listen, there's no reason to start with something that's going to determine the path that you're going to go down for the rest of this processing of this file. Let's look at some more examples and see what we can piece together from there. Okay. So before we start looking at this next example, I want to just have a very quick discussion about what is it that processing does. We play about, or we adjust contrast and luminosity. And if you refer to the previous video with the link down in the description there, I discuss luminosity, contrast, and the relationship that that has with impact. Now, if we reduce the highlights by 100% and increase the shadows by 100%, we're effectively reducing contrast by making the lights darker and the shadows brighter. That reduces contrast, and the upshot of that is we reduce impact. Now, if we reduce impact, we are changing how the file will be read. So if I quickly just dive in and make the adjustment that we love so much, we will see that we have shown more of the inside of the cave now by opening up all those shadows. And we no longer get that impression of looking out into the landscape because we're much more contained within the cave, because we can see more of it. So therefore it becomes a place that we want to explore. The contrast of the file has been reduced, and therefore the impact of the file has been reduced. Everything has become very explicit, and some of the mystery has been lost, and basically it no longer meets my intention for what I wanted to say about that experience and for the thing as a photograph, where I wanted that feeling of looking out into the landscape from a dark, contained space. So if I back off in the shadows to make the cave somewhat more mysterious, and then I open up my highlights again, we can see now that we get that strong impression of looking out into the landscape. There's a direct relationship between contrast, luminosity, and impact. Dropping your highlights by 100 and increasing your shadows by 100 reduces contrast and therefore reduces impact. Now, of course, we can go in and start playing around with white points and black points and white sliders to try and increase the contrast again. But what more people tend to do is start looking at the clarity slider and the vibrance slider to try and reintroduce vibrance and contrast into the files, therefore making them sometimes a bit more grungy. I want to maintain a realistic approach to landscape photography where things look like they're supposed to look. So hopefully this example highlights that relationship between the highlight slider and the shadow slider and luminosity and contrast, and the relationship between luminosity, contrast, and impact. Like I said, there's a link down below which will show you where the next video is, which is luminosity, contrast, and impact. I've also written a book about luminosity and contrast, and in that 200 plus pages, I go into great detail about this whole concept of how we engage with photographs, how we engage with landscapes, what triggers our love of the landscape, and what forces us or makes us make images. So this whole thing is interconnected in that the highlights and slider and the shadow slider are the same as every other slider in Lightroom, is they affect luminosity and contrast and therefore affect impact. The key thing with landscape photography is to articulate something about yourself and your relationship with that content. You cannot do that if you're doing what somebody else tells you to do. So it's a case of finding where on those sliders is your sweet spot, the bit that talks to you. And in the next example, we'll start one from scratch and see where some of that stuff leads us to. So what does all this mean? Rather than looking at one individual case, I've made a little collection of 5 images. And they're all different. They're all from various places around the world, from China to Spain. And they're all creatively different, they're all inspirationally different, they all represent different things to me, and I engage with them all in different ways. So there's nothing really similar about any of the images at all. Why on earth would I ever want to approach them in the same way? To me, that just baffles me, because I think the reason for processing images is because you have a connection with it, and it's the articulation of that connection that is contemporary landscape photography. Because if we don't articulate, then why are we doing it? Yeah. Yes, we might go to pretty places. Yes, we might have a nice time when we're there. But why? What's the point? Here we are in Lightroom, and these are the 5 images. This one's from China, Spain. In fact, all 4 of those are from Spain. So I'm going to go into the develop module with this image, and let's kill the highlights and open the shadows. Now, the first thing that's happened with this image is that I can now see all of that rock face on the left-hand side. And personally, I don't want to see the whole rock face on the left-hand side. The second thing that's happened here, which is kind of insidious of this type of adjustment, is I'm starting to get a halo. And it's up here on the left-hand side where the shadow area is meeting the highlights area. And if I skim through the images, we might see this halo in other places as well. You can see it on the skyline there. That one doesn't have a skyline. This one, again, we're seeing lots of detail in those shadows. And that one. Okay, so if I carry on and try and rectify this, the first thing I'm going to have to do is start darkening the image again. And you can see that halo just isn't going to go away. And that halo is going to be an absolute deal breaker for me, because what I've done is I've caused a problem that I can't fix, or to fix the problem is going to take me ages of cloning and things like that. Now, I've always had a very firm opinion with processing is don't cause a problem that you have to then fix. It's far easier not to cause problems in the first place. Shadows and highlights used aggressively can lead to haloing between dark areas and light areas. And that haloing is always going to be a problem. So be very, very mindful of that. As we move through the other images, what's happened is we're getting a replication of what we experienced in the last example of the waterfall and the cave, is that by opening the shadows and reducing the highlights, we are reducing contrast, and therefore the images gets flat. I'm a big proponent of trying to introduce 3-dimensionality in photography, and that means we need contrast. We need a difference between the front of the image and the back of the image. And as you reduce the contrast by reducing the highlights and opening the shadows, that contrast will diminish. So I'm not so keen on the way this one looks. This one, everything's obviously got very explicit. This is quite a forgiving image because it's a detailed abstract. So in this particular case, opening the highlights and dropping the shadows isn't really making a massive problem. It's just bringing out lots of detail. And by setting a black point and a white point, this image would probably turn out okay. This is exactly the same as the second example. We've reduced all the contrast because if I reset this image, we can clearly see we have way more contrast in this file. So again, it's one of those situations that we want to make sure that we're not going to make the image worse by doing something that we don't want to do. And again, this one, because it's a night shot, has been quite forgiving in terms of opening the shadows and reducing the highlights. It's made that one okay. So basically, 2 out of the 5 So 40% of the images are looking okay with a highlight drop and a shadow increase. So 40% isn't a great hit rate. If someone said you had a 40% chance of getting hit by a car when you went out for a walk this afternoon, you probably wouldn't take those chances. So the bottom line is that if we approach processing from an individual point of view and look at each image as an individual, then we are in a position where we can be expressive and creative. So hopefully in this short video, we're starting to get an insight into the perils of repetitive processing. In the next video, I'm definitely going to look at this whole concept of getting it right in camera. It's probably one of the most debated topics in landscape photography, and is very much a throwback of kind of films, and particularly color slide film mentality. So let's get ripped into that next week. But for now, check out the luminosity, contrast and impact video that will be up next if you care to stick around. Hopefully you've enjoyed this afternoon. Please click the subscribe button and that bell notification, and I'll see you all next week for some more looking at the perils of contemporary landscape photography. Have a great weekend, everyone. Hope you get some good light and it's not too roasting hot wherever you are. So all the best. Bye.